Awesome. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another special session for the Adaptation Planning and Practices training. Today, what we're going to do is really dive into some of the NIAC's climate adaptation menus of strategies and approaches. And so these are tools that you can use as a part of the adaptation workbook process to really think about different tactics and ideas and boost your creativity for how we can be adapting to some of those climate change impacts and challenges and opportunities that you've talked about so far throughout the course. So again, you can find all of these strategies and menus on our website. So if you go to forestadaptation.org/strategies, or if you're on forestadaptation.org and you go to that little adapt button, you can click on that and pull up all of the different menus of adaptation strategies and browse them from there. So it's just a good resource to keep in mind as we're going through today. So what we're going to do as an agenda is we're really going to take you on a tour of our adaptation menus. So we'll really talk about what is a menu, why are they important, how do we use them, how are they built, what goes into creating a menu, and then we'll provide some examples from the forest menu and the tribal adaptation menu. And then we'll end with some breakout groups where we've got a wildlife menu, fire, urban, carbon, and wetlands and watersheds. So you can pick which one you want to learn more about and do a deep dive into those different menus and some breakout room discussions later on at the second half of our session today. So again, throughout this whole training, we've been working our way through the adaptation workbook process, which is this structured adaptive management framework where we're incorporating what you value, your management goals and objectives, and that climate consideration piece into each step of this process. And now what we're going to do in this special session today and in our lecture this afternoon is really think about that step 4, where we're starting to identify those adaptation approaches and tactics. And that step is really where these menus of adaptation strategies and approaches come into play. So they're really starting to give us a tool to really think about how are we connecting our dots from our goals to our impacts to our actions that we want to come up with to really identify those tactics for your particular projects to address your major climate impacts. And so as we're thinking about our menus, they've really been structured based around some of these larger adaptation concepts. So we can really think about how do we want our ecosystems to adapt to change? And we're really defining adaptation as the adjustment of ecosystems in preparation or response to climate change. And the activities that we implement for adaptation really build upon what we're doing with sustainable forest management and conservation and restoration. And so the menus that we use are really taking a lot of these adaptation ideas to really think about the spectrum of adaptation responses. So we can really think about this in terms of how are we helping the system persist under a changing climate into the future. So we're resisting change, improving defenses against disturbance, maintaining unchanged conditions. Again, with resilience, we're thinking again about that persistence, but it's that rubber band analogy of how are we accommodating some degree of change, but returning to a prior condition following those disturbances. And then finally, transition, where we're intentionally facilitating that change and enabling the system to respond to those new and changing conditions. And so really thinking about how we can adapt across the spectrum of adaptation options can help us have a large suite of ideas for how we can ultimately decide to respond to those impacts through our actions. So these menus will really have some ideas that are on the persistence end. How do we maintain that system all the way to the transition end? So how are we going to intentionally facilitate change to something that's future adapted? And so our menus are really these collections of plausible adaptation options, and they're going to be specific to those different disciplines. So for example, the forest menu really focuses on how are our forest resources responding. We also have a wildlife menu, which is really thinking about how are those different wildlife species going to respond to climate change? How can we promote habitat, that sort of thing. And so the menus will really focus on those different disciplines depending on which topic you pick. They're also organized into a tiered hierarchy. So we'll explain that more in a little bit here, but they've got broad ideas that help you funnel your way down to those prescriptive actions. And they're really thorough and comprehensive. So they do include some opposing ideas. So just like a menu at a restaurant, you don't want to pick everything off of these adaptation menus because it's going to be too much. You really want to pick and choose the strategy and approach that makes the most sense to you based on your management goals and objectives and for the particular characteristics of your location. So just like in step 2, when we really dove into thinking about what are those unique characteristics and features of your project area, that's going to be just as important in this step for helping you pick the strategies and approaches that you want to use. And so again, we've really started with the forest menu in 2012. Since then, we've added a ton of different topics and a variety of perspectives. So all of these menus on this list are ones that we now have these different topical resources for to really think about what are these different climate adaptive responses for these different areas. So from forests to urban forests, agriculture, forested watersheds, tribal and cultural resources, forest carbon management, non-forested wetlands, recreation, glacial lakes fisheries, wildlife, fire adapted ecosystems, and Great Lakes coastal habitats. And then we also have some grassland menus and development. So keep your eye out for that as well. But again, we've really, as we've heard a need for all of these different focus areas, is how we've really brought together some managers and scientists and gone through the literature to really create these menus for all of these different topical areas. So those are what menus are. Now we're going to talk about why they're important and why they can really help you as you're working your way through the adaptation workbook process. And so there's kind of 4 main benefits for that these menus provide as you're using them. So they really help address challenges in implementing adaptation by connecting those really broad ideas and concepts of resistance, resilience, and transition, or resist, accept, direct to those specific prescriptive actions that you're going to come up with for your project areas. They also help us make our actions intentional. They help us communicate our ideas so that future managers know what we're trying to do, and they really boost our creativity. We hope they're giving you some new ideas that you might not have thought of before viewing these menus before. So first, really thinking about how do we connect those broad ideas to those specific actions. Again, as I mentioned, these menus are really organized into these tiered hierarchies. So we've structured them so that they really start with those broad concepts, resistance, resilience, transition. Then they dive into more specific strategies, which are still those broad ideas and conditions that are great for a region and really sound a little bit like your management goals. Then they go down to approaches. So those are even more specific, tangible ideas for a specific ecosystem type. They might align with some of your management objectives. And then finally, you get to come up with those prescriptive tactics or actions for your local set of conditions and management goals and objectives for your project area. And each of these menus will have examples of tactics that you can view and browse and select from. But really, the tactics is your chance to come up with what makes the most sense, how can you get creative, and what do you want to implement for your particular place, connecting it back to those approaches and strategies and concepts. And so, for example, we can use the menu to really brainstorm these ideas. So let's say you work in a hemlock system that's located in the lower extent of its southern range. You really value hemlock and you want to retain it, but with the extensive warming, with increased temperatures and shorter winters, for your region, you're not sure you can keep hemlock where it is. So you want to use the forest menu to start thinking about some ideas of how you can adapt your hemlock forest. So we're really going to think, for this example, about resilience. How are we going to promote persistence and really enable your system to respond to some of these disturbances from these shorter winters and warming temperatures? So as you're looking through the menu, really thinking about how do you persist hemlock on your forest, even though it's at the southern extent of its range, you find the strategy that says you want to maintain or create refugia. So that's one example of that broad regionally specific strategy. To get down to even more detail with the approach, you decide you want to prioritize and maintain unique sites. So really finding where are those unique refugia sites for hemlock on your project location. And then that prescriptive tactic that is for your project, you decide to manage north-facing slopes on your property as cool condition islands for northern tree species and retain all hemlock and promote hemlock regeneration. So hopefully with that example, you can see how you can start with those really broad concepts of resilience and then work your way through this tiered hierarchy down to those really prescriptive tactics for your particular project or location based on what you want to achieve with your goals and objectives. These menus also help make our actions intentional. So we really emphasize this as we walk through the adaptation workbook process. But one of the key things is that this really is a decision support tool for your planning, where we're really connecting the dots from our goals and objectives all the way down to what we're implementing with those specific tactics. And so these menus are a key step in this process to really document your thought process of what you're thinking and what you're trying to do and how the actions you want to implement connect back to those climate impacts and your management goals and objectives. And this process really helps you leave that and describe your train of thought so that future managers know what you are trying to do. The menus also help with communicating our ideas. So using these menus really allow people in different places, coming from different contexts, to all speak the same adaptation language with a consistent description and definition of their ideas. And so we can really use these menus and the strategies and approaches to succinctly describe what we're doing and why. And we have lots of demonstrations and examples of projects who have gone through this process and really use the adaptation workbook process and menus to communicate their ideas. So you can find all of those examples on the website at forestadaptation.org/demos. And then finally, we're hoping that these menus will help boost creativity and lead to some new ideas and connections, and really provide new perspectives or new ideas around tactics or actions you might not have considered before, and really start to connect with some of those different perspectives for different managers and see things from a different way, but especially thinking about some of those transition ideas as well. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand it off to Stephen.
Thanks, Courtney. That was great. We're actually doing really well for time. So maybe before I launch into my part, I'm wondering if there are any questions for Courtney covering that first half of the discussion about what is a menu and why did we create them this way. Does anyone have any questions for Courtney?
Go ahead, Alan. You're muted.
Are these slides going to be available after the presentation?
Yes, we will send these out in the newsletter after the session today.
Hi, Courtney. I had a quick question.
Hi, Sarah. Go for it.
So besides citing some of the literature that's built into the workbook or the strategy document itself that we've been reading, how would we cite the workshop tool if we were to use it in like a NEPA project analysis? Like, would we just say we used, the adaptation workbook provided by NIAX, or how are people phrasing that?
Yeah, I think the best citation is the GTR, the Forest Adaptations 2016 GTR. I think it's Swanson et al. 2016, but we can make sure we get you that link. But that's the best citation to use because it walks through the entire adaptation workbook process, the climate change response framework, and the menus of strategies and approaches. So that is a comprehensive citation for all of those different tools.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, any Any other lingering questions for Courtney before I proceed? Thanks, Danielle, for sharing that link. Okay, I'm going to pick up the thread now. Are people seeing my slides? Perfect. Okay. So thanks, Courtney, for covering kind of the background of what is an adaptation menu, why are they set up the way they are, and how does that help them become more functional. I wanted to provide a little more introduction and explanation before we go into those breakout groups that Courtney mentioned. So I'm going to cover briefly, how do we build these adaptation menus, just in case folks are wondering, like, where do these ideas come from? And then I'll walk through 2 examples of adaptation menus before we go into the breakouts. So, oh, you know what? I think I lost a slide about how they're built. Oh, there they are. Okay, so how are menus created? I was in the wrong place. I won't go into all the gory details here, but I do want to just talk generally about our process at NIAX for creating different adaptation menus. Like Courtney said, we have a whole library of them now, over a dozen adaptation menus since the creation of our first forestry specific adaptation menu. All of them have been developed in slightly different ways, but they follow the same pattern. And the overall recipe involves a couple key ingredients. First of all, we wait until we sense a need from a land management community. And so we have always tried to proceed deliberately here, waiting until people are requesting, hey, I work in this field and I don't have a way to articulate my adaptation actions or the array of possibilities that I hear in the literature. We need something like this in my field. And so we're usually waiting for partner organizations to approach us and express an interest in helping us create this kind of menu. And so that's the second point here, is that NIAX has historically worked with partners in those specific disciplines to create different adaptation menus. We don't try to extend ourselves into other fields and pretend to be experts where we're not. So we're trying to be always guided by partners with more relevant knowledge. As we create, once we've kind of confirmed that there is a need, we have a team of partners ready to work with us. 2 main content phases of building these menus. First is a synthesis of the existing literature that's out there. What has been written in this field related to climate change impacts and adaptation, and can we extract useful ideas, either like general adaptation concepts or specific examples of how adaptation could proceed within this field. So doing that kind of assessment of what's available in the literature is one piece that is essential for all of these adaptation menus. And then the second, like you might imagine, is discussion and interaction and vetting with land managers or resource managers who are working in these fields. And so that either happens through, in some cases, structured interviews with an array of managers until we kind of hit that saturation curve of not getting any new ideas. Sometimes one-on-one consultations and kind of test driving a draft menu with some example projects in kind of a sequence. We've also done pilot workshops where we advertise to an entire community in a region and say, hey, we're working on this menu. Come to this workshop. We'll all go through the adaptation workbook together. And at the end of this session, you can tell us where we missed the boat or where we need to change the explanation or the language in these menus to better reflect the choices that you think you have at your disposal. And those kind of interactions with managers have consistently yielded new ideas and better ways of describing these adaptation actions. all of the adaptation menus that NIAX has created have gone through a formal peer review process. Regardless of where they end up getting published, we think it's important to maintain that rigor. So all of our menus have received that kind of peer review. And then they have been published in a variety of outlets, either as Forest Service general technical reports, like Courtney already mentioned. In some cases, they're published in scientific journals, and we try to find a journal that people working in that field will recognize and use. And in some cases, they're published through the USDA and the US Department of Agriculture Climate Hubs. So anyway, just a little commentary on how we've created these menus in the past. I'm happy to answer questions, or folks in your breakout rooms can talk about the specifics of how one particular menu was created compared to the others. Okay, now we're going to talk about some examples really quickly. Starting with the original, the godfather of all NIAX adaptation menus, is our original forest adaptation menu. This was written to address those parts of our audience with kind of a forest management and silviculture focus. Like Courtney described, our menus include general strategies and more specific approaches. And so I'm leaving this slide up for a while so that you have a chance to scan the 10 general strategies in this forest adaptation menu. And we have a little schematic here on the slide that kind of shows how these strategies are generally arranged from being more resistance focused ideas at the front end of the menu toward more transition ideas at the end of the menu, but also highlighting this idea that one strategy can be put to use for a variety of different adaptation options, right? So you can do a whole lot of work on species diversity, and that could either be for a resistance or a resilience mindset. Similar like if you have a focus on genetic diversity, maintaining and enhancing genetic diversity, you can do that with a really transition-oriented mindset, or you can do it with a more of a resilience-oriented mindset. So those categories are not hard and fast, but you see generally how the strategies align. And those of you who are foresters reading through this forestry menu, hopefully you're seeing some keywords that really spark your interest and give you a clue of what's happening within the specific approaches in this general strategy, right? So biological stressors, refugia, species and structural diversity, genetic diversity, community adjustments. So all of those things are hopefully clear enough to give you kind of a signpost and some clue about what happens within that strategy. So just taking one example pathway through this menu from a real world project in northern Wisconsin, working with a county land department. They were worried about ongoing and prior widespread tree mortality due to an extended drought in this part of the state that really enhanced the damage or exacerbated the damage of a native pest, two-line chestnut borer, on a whole broad extent of oak forests in their county. And so they ended up pursuing one of those transition-oriented strategies, facilitating community adjustments through species transitions. That's strategy 9 in here. So they started going down this pathway in their discussions. There are several approaches underneath this strategy, and they specifically zeroed on approach 9.1, favoring or restoring native species that are expected to be adapted to future conditions. So again, this offers a lot more detail on how this general idea could be implemented. There are different approaches in strategy 9 that focus on eliminating maladapted species as kind of the other side of the coin. There are other approaches that focus on doing some long distance or longer distance assisted migration. That's not what they choose. And this one, they focused on this one that's really emphasizing restoring native species with an eye toward the future. So you're doing transition, but still with native species. And the tactic that they decided to employ, these are the ideas that they articulated above and beyond the menu. So the menu is just a springboard to fill in your own tactics. And so then we had this discussion. Which species? Jack pine, red pine, bur oak, Juneberry. Why are we picking those species? They had specific criteria in mind and values that they wanted to maintain on this property. How much? When? All of those details are in their tactics column, so to speak. So just to, that's a nice example to show you kind of general to specific. We have interactive versions of this forestry menu and all our other menus on the adaptationworkbook.org website. So you can click and expand. All of these kind of have accordion menus. So you can examine those specific approaches under the general strategies. You can even get some example tactics in case you're looking for some help brainstorming. So all of that is what's included in these kind of dynamic interactive versions. Okay, the other menu I wanted to show you briefly is one that is not embedded in the online adaptation workbook, but I still wanted to make you all aware of it. And that is our tribal adaptation menu. This is a menu, like I mentioned, that would not have been possible without a large array of partners that requested this and agreed to help us create it, including tribal nations and tribal organizations across the upper Midwest. And this menu was created out of this awareness that the conventional way we talk about climate change risk and adaptation really reflects this kind of Western science mentality of understanding an ecosystem, deciding what's best, and doing kind of command and control. I pull this lever to get this result out of my ecosystem. And we have worked with tribes at our adaptation workbook workshops for years before a couple folks approached us and said, hey, this is great, but it doesn't really reflect our perspective on how we talk about the rest of creation and our kin, our relatives, and the relationship we have with those beings. And it also doesn't really reflect kind of the unique situation of tribes, in many cases being confined to particular locations. In the case of tribes that have reservations or ancestral lands, where the climate is changing around them, right? They don't necessarily have the opportunity to pick up and move the way the rest of broader society does. So is this idea to try to express unique ideas about relationship, adaptation, and more of a kin-centric perspective, and express that in this field of climate adaptation in a new way. So that's kind of that was the mentality that went into creating this tribal adaptation menu. We'll share the document here so you can see it, and you will see clearly that it has a unique focus on cultural practices, language, customs that are unique to tribes in the upper Midwest. But it still has that architecture of a NIAX adaptation menu in that we try to bin ideas the same way in terms of strategies, approaches, and tactics to give people that hierarchical understanding of how do I fit into this and how do I use it as a springboard to generate my own ideas. A place where there's a really big departure here from the tribal adaptation menu to some of our other adaptation menus is really highlighted in these first three strategies, which are not about ecosystem management per se, as much as they are about working with and understanding the community and kind of understanding your role in the larger community of life. So strategy 1, considering cultural practices and seek spiritual guidance. And there are a bunch of specifics. I'm showing some of the approaches to that strategy on the page here. So consulting cultural leaders, community members, and elders, considering mindful practices of reciprocity, understanding the human and landscape history of the community. All those are example approaches, for example. And just another example to show how a real project has used this menu. So strategy 3, supporting tribal engagement in the environment. A group we were working with really picked up on this idea of maintaining and revitalizing traditional relationships and uses. And specifically, the tactic they decided to employ was utilizing traditional fire practices and ceremony to encourage blueberry growth. So conducting prescribed fire in a way that acknowledges those traditional practices, timing, ceremony, reciprocity, all the things that go into a cultural burn compared to a conventional prescribed burn. When you click through the online adaptation workbook, you won't see the tribal adaptation menu options presented there. The author team here has decided to keep the tribal adaptation menu more of a in-person interactive tool that we use, but we can share the PDF with all of you. You can scan through it and you can manually grab these ideas and include them in your adaptation plan. We just haven't, it's not integrated online to respect the wishes of the author team here. I can share more information about that if there are any questions. So that's my tour of 2 menus to give you a couple examples and a little more context. I'll pause here. Courtney, am I missing anything? Are we doing okay?
We're doing great. Does anyone have any questions for Stephen?
I'm not looking at the chat if there are questions there.
Looks like Alan, you raised your hand.
Yeah, your maps tended to focus on Midwestern tribal groups. And I wondered, one, if it also included Northeastern groups, and if there were some tribal organizations in New England that were interested in accessing this, would they approach NEACs and request copies of it?
Yeah, good question, Alan. I'll try to be brief. Short response is we have done tribal adaptation menu workshop in Akwesasne in upstate New York. And what you suggested is already happening. So we've got groups like United Southern and Eastern Tribes and a couple of the Wabanaki bands. They have taken our Midwestern tribal adaptation menu, and they're currently working on their own version to think about, okay, what could we insert in here to more appropriately reflect our culture and customs and the way we talk about the world. And that's we've considered this tribal adaptation menu to be like open source code from the beginning. So we've got a group in New England led by a team in Maine, kind of repurposing it up there. We've got a group in the Southwest doing the same thing, and we're having a workshop in Oklahoma later this year with the Chickasaw Nation, wondering if they might make it their own. So we do hope it'll be regionalized through time. Okay, I'm going to set up these breakout groups quickly. I think Courtney has already constructed these in the background. So we're kind of setting this up as like a little, I don't know, science fair or something for you all. You get to roam through and choose which booth you want to stop at for a couple of minutes and chat. We're going to do 2 rounds. So you get to have 2 choices. Spend a little time with one menu, take a break. We'll come back to the main room, and then Courtney will send us out again.